In the quiet heart of the Arizona wilderness, a rescue dog named Daisy was about to do something no one had ever seen before. 3 tiny bobcat cubs, orphaned and refusing to eat, were seconds away from death, until Daisy stepped in. But what started as an act of survival would soon turn into a bond that defied nature itself, and when the cubs grew up, what happened left everyone speechless. The morning sun painted the skies above Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary in soft shades of gold, but for Emily Johnson, the day was far from peaceful. At 58, Emily had seen every kind of rescue: broken wings, starving fawns, injured eagles, but nothing prepared her for the phone call that came in just after sunrise. "Emily, we've got 3 bobcat kittens," said Ranger Mike, his voice trembling. "We found them in a box at a truck stop. The mother didn't make it." Emily's heart sank. Another victim of the illegal wildlife trade. She didn't waste a second. Within 30 minutes, she was standing over a small examination table, staring at 3 fragile bundles of spotted fur, each no bigger than her hand. Their eyes were half open, glassy with fear. Their tiny bodies trembled with hunger. One of them, a female with a small white patch on her ear, gave a weak hiss, a sound so faint it broke Emily's heart. "Oh, little ones," she whispered softly, "you shouldn't be here. You should be in the wild, with your mama." But their mother was gone, and their survival now rested entirely in Emily's hands. For the next 3 days, she tried everything she knew: bottle feeding, syringe feeding, heat therapy, but nothing worked. The cubs refused milk. Their energy faded with every passing hour. The smallest one suffered a mild seizure. By the 3rd night, Emily sat alone in her office, her head buried in her hands. The sanctuary's dim light flickered over stacks of reports and half-empty formula bottles. She dedicated 30 years to saving animals, but this felt hopeless. That's when her granddaughter Lizzie quietly entered the room. A wildlife biology student, Lizzie had inherited her grandmother's compassion but carried fresher ideas. She placed a steaming mug of coffee beside Emily. "Gran," she said softly, "I think I have an idea. What about Daisy?" Emily looked up, confused. "Daisy? The rescue dog? She's barely a year old herself." "Exactly," Lizzie replied. "She just weaned her puppies 3 weeks ago. She's still lactating, and she's the gentlest dog we've ever had." Emily hesitated. It sounded absurd. A dog raising wild bobcats? It went against every rule of animal rehabilitation. But Lizzie pressed on. "You always said sometimes we have to try the unthinkable, right? Maybe this is it." Emily stared at her granddaughter, torn between reason and desperation. Then, after a long silence, she whispered, "All right. Bring Daisy." The following morning, the sanctuary prepared for something no one had ever attempted. In a quiet room filled with soft blankets and the scent of formula, a young golden-furred dog walked in, tail low, eyes curious. She approached Emily, then leaned toward the towel-wrapped kitten. The cub hissed weakly, too tired to fight. Emily held her breath. And then, something incredible happened. Daisy whined softly, then began to lick the kitten's tiny head, gentle, motherly, instinctive. The kitten froze, then slowly nestled against Daisy's warm fur. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe," she whispered, "the unthinkable is exactly what they need." For the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope inside the Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary. Daisy, the golden-furred rescue dog, curled her body protectively around the 3 fragile bobcat cubs, her soft breath steady and warm. Emily and Lizzie watched in silence, afraid that the slightest sound might break the fragile magic unfolding before them. Hours passed. The kittens, once listless and cold, began to stir. Their tiny paws flexed against Daisy's fur, and faint squeaks escaped their throats. One by one, they nestled closer, searching instinctively for the warmth and comfort they had lost. "Look at them," Lizzie whispered. "They're responding to her." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "She's giving them something we couldn't, a heartbeat." Over the next few hours, Emily documented every movement, every tiny improvement, but she refused to let her guard down. The cubs were still dangerously weak, and Daisy's milk alone wasn't enough. Emily carefully mixed a specialized formula, warming it just to body temperature, then brought a dropper close to the smallest kitten's mouth. This time, something miraculous happened. Instead of turning away, the cub began to lick at the liquid. Just a few drops, but enough to make Emily's heart race. By nightfall, all 3 cubs had eaten small portions of formula, still clinging to Daisy's side as though they had known her forever. For the first time since their rescue, Emily dared to hope. But hope in animal rescue is fragile as the lives you're trying to save. 2 days later, the smallest cub, the one with the white patch on her ear, stopped eating again. She lay limp in Daisy's fur, her breathing shallow. Emily could see the life fading from her tiny body. "She's shutting down again," Lizzie said, panic rising in her voice. "No," Emily whispered, "not after all this." Daisy seemed to sense it too. She nosed the kitten gently, then began to lick her face again and again, the same rhythmic grooming she'd given on that first day. The kitten twitched, let out a faint mew, and moved closer to Daisy's chest. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. "She's fighting," Lizzie murmured. Emily barely slept that night. She sat beside Daisy's enclosure, watching the unlikely family through the dim glow of a heat lamp. The dog never moved from her spot. Every so often, she'd adjust her body so that all 3 cubs stayed within the circle of her warmth. By morning, the smallest kitten was still alive, weaker but alive. Against every odd, Daisy's constant care had kept her heart beating. Days turned into a week, and something extraordinary happened. The kittens began to gain weight. Their dull fur grew brighter, and their once vacant eyes now followed movement with feline curiosity. They climbed over Daisy's legs, batted at her tail, and even tugged playfully at her ears. Daisy didn't mind. She wagged her tail softly and let them explore, watching with gentle patience. Emily could hardly believe it. The same cubs that had been minutes from death were now thriving. "They're stronger every day," Lizzie said, smiling as she jotted notes into her logbook. Emily smiled back. Because of her. Because of Daisy. The bond between the dog and the wild cats had grown deeper than anyone expected. Daisy wasn't just their guardian, she had become their mother. She cleaned them, protected them, and even growled softly when anyone came too close. The staff at the sanctuary began calling the cubs by names: Patch, the small female, Scout, the bold one, and Rascal, the curious explorer. Daisy seemed to know each name by heart. When Emily called for Patch, Daisy's eyes would shift immediately toward the little white-eared cub. By the end of the 2nd week, the transformation was undeniable. The bobcats were alive, not just surviving but living. And yet, deep inside, Emily knew that every miracle in the wild comes with its own challenge. "They won't stay this small forever," she said quietly, watching them tumble through the grass beside Daisy. Lizzie nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "What happens when they remember they're wild?" Emily didn't answer. Because somewhere in her heart, she already knew, the real struggle had only just begun. Weeks passed, and what began as a desperate experiment was now turning into something no one at Whispering Pines had ever witnessed. The bobcat cubs, Patch, Scout, and Rascal, were growing stronger by the day. Their once glassy eyes now gleamed with life, and their spotted coats shimmered under the morning light. Daisy, the gentle rescue dog, had become their world. She fed them, cleaned them, and even carried them gently by the scruff when they wandered too far from her side. To anyone watching from outside the enclosure, the sight was nothing short of unbelievable, a domestic dog nursing and protecting 3 wild bobcats as if they were her own puppies. But behind every miracle in nature lies a question: how long can it last? One afternoon, Emily stood by the fence, notebook in hand, watching as Daisy herded the cubs back into the shade. Lizzie joined her, smiling softly. "She's incredible, isn't she?" Emily nodded, still amazed. "I've worked with animals for 30 years, Lizzie, but I've never seen anything like this." The cubs had started eating small pieces of meat now, mixed with milk formula, but they refused to sleep anywhere except curled beside Daisy. When she moved, they followed. When she barked softly, they obeyed. Their wild instincts, though still present, seemed softened, reshaped by love and trust. Emily documented everything: their feeding times, their weight gain, even the way Daisy responded to each of their individual calls. She knew this was more than a story. It was science, a rare glimpse into how emotional bonds could transcend species. But as the cubs grew, so did a silent fear in Emily's heart. "They're getting big," she said one evening as she and Lizzie cleaned the feeding area. "I know," Lizzie replied, glancing at the enclosure. "Scout's almost the size of Daisy now." "And that's exactly what worries me," Emily admitted. "Bobcats are wild predators. At some point, their instincts could take over. What happens to Daisy then? Lizzie fell silent. She had thought about it too, but didn't have an answer. The following morning, Emily called a meeting with Dr. Rivera, the sanctuary's consulting veterinarian. He listened carefully as she described the cubs' progress and their attachment to Daisy. Their physical health is perfect, Emily said, but their emotional bond, it's unlike anything I've seen. I'm afraid separating them could cause severe trauma. Dr. Rivera nodded thoughtfully. It's extraordinary, Emily. But you're right, this situation can't last forever. They'll reach maturity soon. You need to start planning how to transition them safely. Emily sighed. I just wish there was another way. That night, she walked out to the enclosure alone. The moonlight shimmered across the ground as Daisy slept, curled around the 3 growing cubs. Patch's paw rested on Daisy's leg. Scout's tail flicked lazily. Rascal snored softly against her chest. It was a picture of peace, but also of impossible love. A dog and 3 wild cats, bound together by something even science couldn't explain. You've done something amazing, girl, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But how do I protect all of you from what comes next? Days turned into weeks, and the cubs grew rapidly. Their play became rougher, their claws sharper. Yet Daisy never flinched. When they wrestled too hard, she barked once, low and firm, and they'd immediately calm down. The staff began calling her the mother of miracles. But even miracles have limits. By their 4th month, the bobcats had reached a stage where most would begin learning independence, how to hunt, how to survive on their own. Emily knew the time was coming when she would have to make the hardest decision of her career. Separate Daisy from the cubs she had saved, or risk losing them all to instincts that no love could fully tame. That night, she stood by the enclosure as Daisy watched her 3 bobcats play beneath the stars. Sometimes, Emily murmured, the hardest part of love is knowing when to let go. But deep down, she knew this story was far from over. Because nature had one more unthinkable twist in store, one that would test every rule of survival, and every bond of the heart. The morning breeze swept through the sanctuary, carrying the faint scent of pine and wildflowers. Daisy was lying in the shade, her golden fur glowing in the soft light. All around her, the 3 bobcat cubs tumbled and chased one another, their playful growls echoing through the quiet air. It had been months since Daisy first met the orphans, and no one at Whispering Pines could deny it now. This was more than just survival. It was something sacred. Emily often stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching in quiet wonder. Daisy's patience seemed endless. When Patch climbed onto her back, Daisy simply sighed and let her balance there like a proud mountain. When Rascal bit her tail during play, Daisy didn't scold, she wagged it gently, as if saying, "Try again, little one." "They think she's their mother," Lizzie said one afternoon, smiling as she recorded a video. "She is," Emily replied softly. "Maybe not by nature, but certainly by heart." Every day brought new changes. The cubs were learning to stalk and pounce, their movements becoming sharper, more feline. Yet, every time they got too carried away, Daisy's gentle bark brought them back into line. She was their teacher, their comfort, their protector. At feeding time, Daisy always waited until the cubs were done eating before she took her share of food. If one of them growled possessively, she would back off without protest, letting them learn without fear. It wasn't just nurturing, it was wisdom. Even the sanctuary staff noticed something deeper unfolding. Animals that had once been skittish around humans began calming when Daisy was near. Her presence seemed to carry peace, not just to the bobcats but to the entire sanctuary. Emily began documenting Daisy's behavior meticulously, every interaction, every gesture, every change. She realized this wasn't just an emotional story, it was a scientific marvel. The footage of Daisy grooming the bobcats went viral online, touching millions of hearts. Messages poured in from across the world. Proof that love knows no species. The world needs more souls like Daisy. But for Emily, this wasn't about fame. It was about witnessing something so pure, so natural, that it redefined everything she thought she knew about animal instinct. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the pines, Emily sat with Lizzie outside the enclosure. The cubs were growing fast, almost too fast. Their once soft features had sharpened into the unmistakable look of wild predators. Yet when Daisy lay down, they still nestled into her side, purring softly. They should be preparing for release, Emily murmured, but they act like they're still her babies. Maybe love changes more than behavior, Lizzie said thoughtfully. Maybe it changes biology too. Emily smiled sadly. If only that were true. Still, she couldn't deny what her eyes saw. The cubs were healthy, strong, and emotionally balanced, something rare for orphans raised in captivity. Daisy had given them more than milk and warmth. She had given them a reason to trust again. At night, when the stars shimmered overhead, Daisy would curl up in the straw, her 3 bobcats pressed close to her chest. Their rhythmic breathing created a soft melody, the sound of life returning after loss. Sometimes, Emily would stand in the darkness just to listen. "This," she whispered once, "is why I do what I do." By their 8th week, the cubs were fully weaned. They ate meat on their own, climbed higher each day, and even began practicing mock hunts, but they always returned to Daisy at dusk. She would greet them with a mother's patience, licking their fur clean and nosing them toward the warmth of their shared bed. The sight was almost surreal, a golden dog and 3 wild bobcats resting in the same heartbeat, predator and prey, nature and nurture, coexisting in perfect peace. To the world outside, it was a miracle. To Emily, it was proof that love itself was the strongest survival instinct of all. But even miracles must evolve. And soon, the sanctuary would face the most painful challenge of all, learning what happens when love must let go. The days at Whispering Pines had turned warm and golden, and the sanctuary buzzed with quiet pride. Visitors whispered in awe at the sight of Daisy and her unlikely cubs. They had become the sanctuary's heartbeat, a living story of love and survival. But behind the smiles and success, Emily carried a heavy weight. The cubs, now 4 months old, were changing fast. Their baby spots had begun to fade, replaced by the golden coats and sharp eyes of young hunters. Their muscles had filled out, their instincts growing stronger each day. And deep down, Emily knew what that meant. "They can't stay here forever," she murmured one morning, watching Scout stalk a butterfly with perfect precision. Lizzie nodded quietly beside her. "They're ready, aren't they?" "Almost. But not for this part." Emily turned to her granddaughter. "We have to start separating them from Daisy." The words hung heavy in the air. Lizzie didn't respond at first. She looked toward Daisy, lying peacefully as the cubs wrestled near her paws, still patient, still protective. "Gran, if we take her away now, they'll think we've taken their mother." "I know," Emily said softly. "But if we don't, they'll never learn to be wild. And that's not fair to them either." It was the hardest truth of all. The love that saved them could now destroy their future. The next morning, Emily and Lizzie tried the first step. While the bobcats were busy eating, they gently led Daisy out of the enclosure and into Emily's cabin a 1/4 mile away. At first, everything seemed fine. But within an hour, the cubs realized she was gone. Their reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Patch, the smallest, began pacing along the fence, calling out with high-pitched cries that echoed through the sanctuary. Rascal scratched at the door, his claws leaving deep marks in the wood. Scout growled and threw himself against the gate, desperate to follow the scent of the only mother he had ever known. From the cabin, Daisy heard them. Her ears perked, her body tensed, and then she began to whine. It was a deep, aching sound that turned into a mournful howl. She pawed at the door until her pads bled. "This isn't working," Lizzie said, tears filling her eyes. "They're panicking." Emily's voice trembled. "If we give in now, it'll only get harder." But hours passed, and the cries didn't stop. The cubs refused food. They huddled in a corner, trembling and confused. Daisy's howls grew weaker, but no less desperate. Finally, Emily couldn't bear it any longer. "Bring Daisy back," she said softly. "We'll try again later." When Daisy returned, the cubs ran toward her with cries that sounded almost human, desperate, relieved, overflowing with emotion. They rubbed against her, purred, and pressed their faces into her fur. Daisy lowered herself to the ground, whining softly as if to say, "I'm here now." Even the staff watching from a distance wiped their eyes. "They've created their own family," Emily whispered. "They don't even know they're different species anymore." Over the next 2 weeks, Emily and Lizzie tried different methods: shorter separations, adjacent enclosures, gradual distance. Nothing worked. Each attempt ended in heartbreak, the cubs' cries, Daisy's restlessness, Emily's guilt. They've imprinted on her completely, Dr. Rivera told Emily over the phone. It's rare, but not unheard of. Still, the longer this continues, the harder the break will be. Emily looked at Daisy through the observation glass, the dog lying calmly with the 3 bobcats nestled against her side. She knew he was right. But she also knew that love had never been logical. They saved each other, she said quietly. And now we have to save them from losing each other. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat outside the enclosure, exhausted and torn. Inside, Daisy's head rested gently on Patch's back, her eyes half closed, her tail thumping softly against the ground. Maybe, Emily whispered, the unthinkable isn't separating them. Maybe it's realizing they were never meant to be apart. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, that single decision to keep the family together a little longer, would change everything that came after. Because the next time they tried to say goodbye, the unthinkable would truly happen. Months passed, and time began to reshape the little family. The bobcats were nearly grown now, strong, sleek, and magnificent. Their muscles rippled beneath their golden coats, their movements more confident, more wild. Yet even as their instincts sharpened, their hearts never forgot the warmth that raised them. Every morning, Daisy would trot beside them as they explored their large outdoor habitat. She watched them chase leaves, climb logs, and test their strength in mock hunts. Though she was smaller than all 3, her presence still commanded quiet respect. Emily often stood by the fence, notebook in hand, still amazed at what she was witnessing. It's like they're part dog, part bobcat, Lizzie joked one afternoon. Emily smiled faintly. No, they're just part love. But as the bobcats neared adulthood, a difficult decision loomed once again. Representatives from a wildlife preserve in Colorado had reached out, offering a permanent home where Patch, Scout, and Rascal could live together in a vast, natural environment. It was an ideal opportunity. The only catch, Daisy couldn't go with them. The day of the separation came quietly. The staff loaded the bobcats into spacious transport carriers while Daisy watched, her tail wagging uncertainly. She didn't understand why everyone looked so serious, why Emily's eyes were red, or why the cubs were calling out in confusion. When the van doors closed, Daisy whimpered. I'm sorry, girl, Emily whispered, stroking her head. They have to learn to be wild now. The sanctuary fell eerily silent after they left. For days, Daisy refused to eat. She waited by the gate every evening, staring into the distance as if expecting them to come back. Emily tried to comfort her, but even she could feel the hollow quiet the cubs had left behind. At the Colorado Preserve, things didn't go as planned either. Though the new habitat was perfect, the bobcats seemed restless and withdrawn. They paced the edges of their enclosure, calling into the night, low, mournful sounds that broke the hearts of everyone who heard them. Dr. Rivera, who had come to oversee their transition, called Emily after the first week. They're physically fine, but emotionally, it's like they're grieving. Emily's heart sank. And Daisy? She's no better, Lizzie admitted. She's just waiting. For 2 weeks, both sides of the bond, the dog and the bobcats, suffered in silence, missing each other with a pain that no one could explain. Finally, the preserve's director made a bold suggestion. What if we reunite them, just once, to see what happens? Emily hesitated only a moment. Then she packed Daisy's leash and made the 12-hour drive to Colorado. When they arrived, Daisy stepped out of the van and froze. Her ears perked up. Her nose twitched. Somewhere ahead, beyond the trees, familiar scents drifted through the air. Let her go, Emily whispered. The moment Daisy saw the enclosure, she ran. The 3 bobcats were perched on a fallen log when they heard her bark, one short, hopeful sound that echoed through the preserve. They turned as one. Then in an instant, all 3 leapt down and sprinted toward the fence, chirping and growling with excitement. The staff looked on in disbelief as Daisy pressed herself against the gate, whining softly. The cubs, now nearly full-grown, rubbed their faces against the bars, purring so loudly it vibrated through the air. I think we just witnessed the impossible, one of the caretakers whispered. The reunion was emotional and chaotic, filled with joyful sounds and trembling hearts. The decision was made then and there. Daisy would stay at the preserve, living nearby with a caretaker but visiting her bobcats every day. Time passed, and the family settled into their new rhythm. Daisy adapted to her new home beautifully, spending her mornings playing with the bobcats under supervision and her nights sleeping by the fireplace in her caretaker Maria's cabin. The bond between them remained as strong as ever. They were wilder now, hunters, climbers, survivors, but when Daisy entered their habitat, they greeted her not as prey or threat, but as mother. It seemed that love had rewritten nature itself. But then, 1 year later, the unthinkable struck again. Emily received a phone call in the middle of the night. It was Maria, her voice tight with panic. "Emily, it's Scout. He's sick. He won't eat, and he won't let anyone near him." Emily's blood ran cold. "I'm coming. And I'm bringing Daisy." She drove through the night, her heart pounding with every mile. When they reached the preserve, Scout was lying weak and still in the corner of his pen, his breathing shallow. The vets had tried everything, medicine, fluids, food, but nothing worked. Then Emily made a decision only she could have made. "Let Daisy in." The door opened. Daisy stepped forward, her nose twitching, her tail still. Scout lifted his head weakly, his golden eyes dull, and then, recognition sparked. With a soft whine, Daisy walked to him, lowered her body beside his, and began to lick his face the same way she had when he was a fragile cub. Everyone in the room held their breath. Minutes passed. Then, for the first time in days, Scout moved closer, pressing his head into Daisy's fur. He began to purr, a deep, trembling sound of peace. When the vet placed a bowl of broth beside him, Scout sniffed it, then lapped weakly at the liquid. Tears filled Emily's eyes. "She's doing what we couldn't," she whispered. "She's healing him." For 3 days, Daisy never left Scout's side. She ate when he ate, slept when he slept, watched over him like the first time she ever met him. By the end of the week, Scout was standing again, stronger, brighter, alive. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just instinct. It was love, pure, unconditional, and beyond reason. Months passed after Scout's miraculous recovery, and life at the Colorado Preserve settled into a rhythm of quiet wonder. The bobcats, Patch, Rascal, and Scout, had fully grown into magnificent adults. They were agile, confident, and breathtaking to watch as they prowled through their forested enclosure, their golden coats flashing under the sunlight. But even in their wild beauty, one truth remained unshakable: they were never truly alone. Every morning, Daisy would trot along the familiar trail toward their habitat, tail swaying gently. The moment her paws touched the soft earth near the fence, 3 shadows would appear among the trees, moving swiftly, silently, until the bobcats emerged, their golden eyes bright with recognition. They would circle around her, rubbing their heads against the bars, purring softly in a chorus that only she could answer. Daisy would whine and wag her tail, pressing her face against theirs as if to count them, one by one, the way only a mother could. It became a ritual of love, unspoken, timeless, and pure. Emily, now in her 60s, often visited the preserve. She would sit quietly by the enclosure, notebook closed, simply watching the family she had helped create. "You changed the rules, Daisy," she whispered once, smiling softly. "You showed us that love doesn't follow species or science. It just is." By then, the story of Daisy and her bobcats had spread far beyond Arizona and Colorado. Wildlife organizations, news channels, and universities all wanted to know how it happened, how a dog could raise wild predators and still live in peace with them. But to Emily, the answer was simple. It wasn't about biology or training. It was about compassion, the one language every heart understands. Years passed gently. Daisy grew older, her muzzle turned silver, her steps slower. But her eyes, those deep, patient eyes, never lost their spark. Even as age took its toll, she never missed a single visit. And every time she arrived, her bobcats were there, waiting. They no longer needed her to survive, but they still needed her presence, her calm, her love, her reassurance that the world could be kind. One autumn evening, as the golden light faded behind the mountains, Emily sat beside Daisy at the fence. The 3 bobcats lounged nearby, purring softly, their eyes half closed in peace. "You know," Emily said gently, "people call it the unthinkable when a dog raises wild cats. But maybe the real unthinkable is how easily we forget that love has no boundaries." Daisy turned her head slightly, resting it on Emily's lap, her tail thumping weakly against the ground. It was a quiet moment, no words, no sound, just the soft rhythm of hearts that had once saved one another. In the years that followed, Emily often shared their story at wildlife conferences and lectures. She would show a simple photo, Daisy lying peacefully beside 3 grown bobcats, and say, "Sometimes, the most powerful medicine isn't a cure or a cage. It's connection." And somewhere at the preserve, in the soft whisper of pine trees and the golden light of sunset, Daisy's legacy lived on, not just in the animals she loved, but in every heart that believed in the healing power of love without limits. Because what began as the unthinkable became unforgettable.